This is CareShift with me, Sathvik Bilakanti, and I'm super excited about our guest today. Jay Fraser is one of the founders and current investor at Sidedoor Ventures, an early-stage fund backing category-defining companies at the intersection of healthcare, technology, and services, with a focus on founders building from lived experience. Jay is such an amazing friend and mentor of mine, so it was truly an honor to interview him and learn so much. Jay, it's amazing to have you on, so thank you for being here today.
Yeah, thanks, Vic. Very excited for the conversation and appreciate you having me on the podcast.
Yeah, I know Sidedoor is such a generalist fund, and I know you're very specifically investing in healthcare, biotech. What is kind of like the most underemphasized, I guess, sectors in healthcare or biotech that you've been looking at the most frequently?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. Part of the challenge, as you alluded to, is Sidedoor at its core is a generalist fund. My role as the healthcare lead is to find those areas that are interesting within healthcare specifically, but it becomes a very broad challenge for us, I'll say. As a generalist fund investing in healthcare, we're taking a look at, solutions that are on the payer, the provider side, are on the patient-facing, the back-end side. We're looking at, drug discovery and sort of the tech bio areas, and then we're looking at more traditional, pharma opportunities as well. So it presents a big challenge. It's one of the, I think, really exciting things, and the things that I love about healthcare as well is there's a ton of different avenues that you can go and areas that you can look. And, with that brings opportunity. For me, I think a handful of the areas that are very interesting to us and we've been putting a lot of time in recently, and, maybe a bit of a misnomer to say they're underemphasized in the investing side, but I think there's a lot of opportunity that's growing and maybe hasn't been fully tapped. Data acquisition and tooling, when I think about this, it's a bit, predicated or backed by some of what we've seen in the LLM space in general is, pharma, tech bio, whoever it is, there's sort of the buy or build strategy that they can take on the data. And a lot of the times, those companies' bread and butter is not necessarily the acquisition of the data, but it's what they're doing on top of that data. And so, if you can be that data provider, very much in the similar way that you saw, the LLM companies building the actual models themselves and, acquiring some of the trading data that was necessary to drive the, outcomes that they were looking for and the model strength. And if you can be that for biotech, I think there's a huge opportunity to capture there, especially as you're looking at all the development that's happening in the protein space or the RNA space. And, I think these more, maybe not novel areas of mechanism, but these, deeper level mechanisms than you typically had with the small molecule is, you're going much deeper. The density of data required to get the output that you're going after as, that tech bio or that pharma company needs to be much richer. And that's where this opportunity is, someone can come along, understand how to structure it, understand how to package it, and understand how to generate it at scale, wherein you have a viable business. The tooling side of the data is like, what you're actually gleaning out of that data is something that I think naturally stacks on top of that. And, both sides, I think, have massive opportunity in biotech. Another area is cell systems. It's a little bit hand in hand with the data side, actually, in the data generation. But, I think a lot of what's been done in terms of drug discovery right now is based on data that exists. And a fair amount of that data is, the output of genetics, more or less, in your genetic code. And it's like, okay, so if you can read the genetic code and you've got that sequence, what protein, what RNA, what enzyme that's going to code for downstream. What I think is missing in a lot of this is what are the changes that happen in a cellular system, in a dish, or, in vivo when you put it into the body. And that's a totally, unexplored or largely unexplored area that, I think is going to be important as more of these ML, developed molecules come to bear. It's like understanding what your predecessor molecule may or may not be enough. And there may be downstream changes that unless you can observe, you could be going after the wrong target just from what the, genetic sequence is telling you. And so I think understanding how, again, to build those types of assays and build those assays in a way where they can scale and generate that rich data set to inform drug discovery, efforts and understand where your intervention lies. Another huge opportunity. I'm partial because of my background, and I'm sure we'll get into this, later in the podcast and discussion, but I'm partial to diagnostics. It's where I spent, sort of my a lot of my time in college and, when I was coming right out of college. And, I think an area that investment stays away from because of the business model and some of the challenges that space has seen historically. But it's also an area with some of the most exciting innovation, especially when you start, looking towards multiplexing and sort of this data density piece and omics. That again is really interesting. I do think under tapped from an investment standpoint, but part in good reason, part in that it's just been really challenging to get these systems to deliver on all the promises or all the hopes that I think people have. And then the last one, anything neuro, I'm highly interested in. It's sort of like the cell systems one. We're just starting to scratch the surface, I think, of what we understand, and how we can extrapolate and interpret sort of what we are seeing at the sort of genetic side of things as well as the in vivo side of things. And, with neuro, it ends up becoming a systems level problem, and the system level problems are the ones that can be the most interesting. They bring a lot of risk with it, but if you can understand how to control that risk and where it's coming from, it becomes a really, really interesting space to think about, where to put money towards and where to dedicate your capital.
Yeah, I mean, specifically, you mentioned clinical diagnostics as a huge kind of layer here and something that you were really interested in. And that can be multiple segmented. You can talk about consumer diagnostics, you could talk about the clinical diagnostics space. What specifically in diagnostics do you look at right now, and what do you think is the biggest opportunity in like 2026 and on?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Again, space is huge because it can be anything from like lab-based diagnostics all the way to in-clinic. I think, an investment that we made in the past was on like vocal biomarkers and some of the diagnostics that you can do around that. I do think that space is really interesting. Being able to tie that back to like a disease state and do that in an accurate way is, obviously difficult and takes sort of, again, it goes into this the data theme, but takes, I think, the right data set as well as the interpretation of the data. Maybe not necessarily diagnostics, but one of the other areas that I do think is interesting and, is gaining prevalence is more on this clinical decision support. And it's like, how can you take data that's coming out of the EMR, that's coming out of lab results, that's coming out of maybe, genetic testing, and start co-piloting some of the decisions that the physicians are making. And, it's, again, maybe not a pure diagnostic tool, but it relies on a lot of the insights that can be gleaned from just the patient record and some of the longitudinal data that exists. And I think, obviously as we get better and better at, I think, storing, parsing, and labeling some of that data coming out of these, clinical systems, we're only going to be able to get better at some of that clinical decision support, tooling and solutions. And, I don't think it should ever replace the physician. I think a lot of people feel that way and would say similarly, but it can be a very good option to point the physician or the provider maybe in a direction that they weren't considering and give them a bit of that second opinion in the background that they can choose to either utilize or disregard.
Right. Kind of going into that clinician piece there, why do you think there's a lot of, I guess, skepticism when it comes to replacing the physician, and how and when can that potentially happen? How is that like a big concept overall?
Yeah, listen, I don't think it can ever truly happen. And, that's probably a hot take because you're seeing, maybe radiology is a good area. You've seen some of these AI radiology tools that end up being able to outperform the radiologists themselves. That being said, like there is a level of intuition that you can build into, some of these tooling systems. You lose some of the concept of practice and maybe some of the understanding of downstream outcomes when you rely purely on a model-based system rather than some element of the, the physician, the radiologist, nurses, anybody on the care team's intuition. And again, I think you can work to build that into the models, but it's going to be hard, at least today, to capture that in a complete respect. Maybe we get there in 5 to 10 years as like, Gen AI gets much better and is able to do this sort of on the fly learning and interpretation. But again, it's not something that I think is going to happen anytime in the near future. As far as the skepticism, I think there's always a bit of an inherent, mistrust or a change management layer to this. Doctors, are maybe one of the harder groups to move, and for good reason, but that they tend to always feel that the opinion that they're providing is, grounded in literature, is grounded in their own experience, as a care provider,
Yeah.
and any of the medical training that they've gotten. And so it's like, it's hard to disrupt the sort of inherent bias to their own views. That's where, like, I don't think it ever rips and replaces on the clinician side. It can be supportive. I mean, it can maybe open up areas of, exploration or treatment that the physician may not have initially considered, but can be, again, grounded in literature, can be grounded in outcomes, and can be grounded in other, aspects and elements of treatment. And that can be, a bit of a nudge on the back end, but not a full rip and replace.
Yeah, like one of the biggest things I guess we're seeing is that doctors provide that sense of empathetical kind of judgment to the patients. And that's kind of like one thing that's kind of like missing with AI overall that we kind of don't have yet in a basis. I mean, we might be getting there, as you mentioned, 5 to 10 years, but that judgment is like completely on the, I guess, under the radar, I guess I would say, where a lot of patients come to the clinician mostly just to get that support that they're looking for. So, no, that makes complete sense. In that specific case, what are those kind of, I guess, tools that are kind of helping physicians that you've been seeing right now when it comes to these Gen AI tools that, are making the biggest impact that you've been seeing with your startups or like other companies overall?
Yeah, I think specialist space is what comes to mind first. It's like there's two ways to think about this, and I'll sort of reflect back on the last question and answer that we were just exchanging. But um, you know, if need a topical cream for a rash that I'm seeing, it's life threatening, maybe it's uncomfortable, but it's not something that, I as the patient feel like I need to go in and see a provider for. And it can be something that's, largely automated through these AI systems and, some of the, the imaging platforms. That maybe is a candidate for the rip and replace. And it's a rip and replace to drive efficiency and to get to that, script and distribution of the medication. I think when you're thinking about clinical decision support specifically, it's where you get into the specialist spaces or space. And I think oncology is a really good one right now for this because of the speed at which new sort of treatments in oncology are coming to market and like the vast amount of data that exists. So it's like, you've got treatment lines 1 through 3 in a lot of cases, and part of what we want to understand better is how to administer those in the way that benefits the patient the best and the most efficaciously at the right time. And maybe that means it's not treatment 1 and then it goes to layer 2. Maybe it's you got to reverse some of this, and an immunotherapy is going to be more effective as your initial line of treatment than just a chemo or radiation. And so I think like understanding the order in which we can deliver care to better react to specific patient scenarios and sort of, longitudinal understanding of that patient as an individual is where these clinical decision support and LLM becomes very helpful. It's all about pattern matching. Where has it seen this before? And again, this comes into the intuition space with the clinician, but the clinician will have some intuition as to where they've seen this before and how they would respond, but their view will oftentimes be limited to the individuals that, they've seen in the practice, and not necessarily like this global layer. You can get that through literature, but if you can provide that immediately through some sort of LLM or clinical decision support system, it becomes like that valuable real-time metric that helps drive some of this change.
I guess we're seeing that a little bit with open evidence, right? Where, they're kind of giving that instant kind of literature on a global scale. And that kind of reminds me where, like, for example, with scribing, there's always like this underlying financial incentive for the clinics when it comes to they're, spending less on medical scribes, and it's obviously making it much more easier to kind of, make more, I guess, generating more revenue for the clinics and things like that. So that financial incentive is something that's super important. I was interested to learn your takes on how startups should navigate financial incentives and figuring out what to do for, I guess, providers and that kind of.
Yeah, I love this question because, I think we see a misunderstanding of how to represent this a lot of the times when we're looking at early stage companies, especially for those that are selling into clinics as some sort of tool for the workforce there, whether it be, the clinical workforce or it be sort of the administrative workforce. And, there's two ways to think about this, and I think you alluded to them both. Is like, one is this providing a revenue lift for the practice, wherein I'm either getting a higher volume of patients through in the day for my given, capacity or staff, or I'm able to more effectively reimburse on codes. And I want to be careful there, because it's not about driving more volume into codes. That's part of the problem that we're seeing, but understanding which codes should be billed for a given procedure, and which ones are most representative of the care delivered and the value of that care delivered. The other camp here is like, well, are you saving time and money on the clinic side? And is it like, well, you're not necessarily driving a capacity increase from the ability to capture more revenue, but you are driving a capacity increase that allows you to improve your, gross margin at the end of the day. And I think the value prop here is different as you look at stakeholders within an organization. Like, the clinicians and the folks working with patients are going to want to spend less time doing admin work. The scribing is a really good example. They want to spend as little time as they can filling out these EHR records and spending more time with patients. That's why they became a doctor, a nurse, a PA, whatever it is. But that value prop is not necessarily going to resonate then with the leadership of that clinic, who are looking at, the bottom line, how much they're spending, how much they're bringing in from a revenue perspective. And I think this is where it becomes maybe difficult from the pitching angle to VCs, as well as the selling angle into clinics for these early stage startups. How you pitch is going to be different depending on your stakeholder. Ultimately, your solution could deliver both of the sort of revenue lift as well as efficiency gains. But how you pitch that and who you pitch that to is incredibly important. I think, like, is one better than the other? Like, if you're thinking about this from an early stage startup angle, I don't think so. If you want to just take the canned answer, anytime you can show a revenue lift, I think you're going to get a little bit more interest. And the reason I say that is because the ROI on efficiency gains it's difficult to show. And how do you anchor that? And if you can't show it, are you going to get a renewal? Are you going to convert from a pilot, et cetera, et cetera? And so at least from an ROI angle, if you can show that you're giving them an additional revenue stream or additional revenue on top of a patient, it's much easier to justify both your pricing as well as the value that you're bringing.
So kind of going back now, kind of go into, I guess, your early times into investing, what really got you into like VC and kind of entrepreneurship overall?
I've sort of always had an insatiable curiosity, and I've always been a builder at heart. VC wasn't really a world that I was aware of until early in my career, and part of the backstory of that, and what I alluded to earlier is, in my junior and senior year of college, I was working in a lab on campus that was developing novel diagnostic technologies, and we ended up submitting that technology to a national design competition. We placed first, and then we formed a company around that. And in that journey, I was exposed to a lot of other founders and teams that were in a similar position. And it was something where I was very interested in their company formation, their story, and what, they were working towards, and sort of how they thought they were going to change the world in some respects. And, I through that joined a handful of groups on the early stage startup side, from founders and operators, and the VC side. And, I kept being very interested in working with these founders and just having this view into like what was coming next. Found my way to the Side Door folks and the original team that we really started this fund with, and the rest is a bit history from then. But I think it comes from the builder side and the always wanting to, I think, create something that's novel and new and has a purpose and has a value that you're bringing, and being able to sit on the other side of the table and not necessarily do that from a building the company that's going to do the next thing, being able to have a front row seat in the audience for what is coming next, and then supporting those founders through their journey is something that, I've always loved, and, it's something that I'm excited to keep doing.
Yeah. So what have you learned from like doing all of this and now in your current like investing? What have you learned from like, whether that be like from your first investment or from your entrepreneurial journeys that kind of got you to where you are now?
Yeah. This will be the canned answer again. I think it is a lot about pattern matching. And I think, first and foremost, especially on the early stage side, it's about pattern matching on the founder side. I think everything else is secondary in that respect, whether it's, market, whether it's product, whether it's price that you're entering at as the investor. If you can successfully pattern match for an early stage founder that just seems to move through challenges that should be real and should be barriers to anybody else, that's someone you want to be investing in, and sort of regardless of all else. And I think that's one of the things that's hard to learn. It's part of like, have you been in their shoes in some respect? Have you gone through the same challenges they've gone through, and do you know where to look around corners and how to support them? And you want to sort of see them thinking about things in the same way that you would be thinking about them if you were in their shoes. I think that's maybe the biggest learning. It's also, part of the hardest learning is being able to do that pattern matching. And then just being able to, I think, see a little bit into the future and forward predict and project like where you think things are going based on where they're at today. That's, obviously really difficult in healthcare. In some respects, it's helpful because the horizon for healthcare is so long. So if you're thinking about anything that's going through clinic, well, you've got a decent amount of time to understand if what's going through the clinic is going to be part of that next wave, or ultimately is not necessarily going to be the angle that ends up making it, or the type of treatment that ends up making it, the mechanism, etc. And you can forward project based on that. So like if it's an immunotherapy or something, okay, well, what's the next step in that immunotherapies? And like, is it on, the large molecule side, or can you start going back to small molecules in areas of RNA interference, etc.? And so like that's, that and the founder piece, I think is just what takes a little bit of time to learn.
Yeah, I mean, you know what they say, like, once you meet like the great founder, you never want to go back, right? Like you always meet so many founders, and then once you meet greatness, you always kind of stack every other founder you meet after that to that one, right? Like, I mean, it's an interesting
It's
concept to
true.
think.
No, I 100% agree. And like, as an investor, you find yourself doing that. It's, you sort of see that founder that, you want to emulate yourself. And then that becomes the benchmark until you find a new founder. And then you always want to be, I think, out benchmarking yourself as you're building your portfolio. It's like, who's the next founder that's going to, take on the entire world if they must, to get their idea across the finish line.
Yeah, and going from like seed to Series A to Series B, like how does Sidor specifically help a specific company, along its journey, and specifically in healthcare companies, whether that be in physical healthcare, physical biotech, or healthcare software? How do you guys help them overall in that journey?
Yeah. I think that part of our bread and butter is helping founders scale, especially from that like seed to Series A. So one of the things, that we do and try to do as a fund is punch above our weight. Here is like, we recognize that the check is really just the minor part of the journey and how we can support the founder. It's one of the benefits of having a team of ex-founders or founding team and early builders is that, as I said, we've got some of the similar lived experiences as the founders, and we've seen where things can go right and go wrong. A la side door ends up becoming a little bit of the Swiss Army knife for the founders in our portfolio, and can be leveraged. We and our network can be leveraged in a variety of different situations. We've helped, Portco sign their first pharma partner, rethink monetization, prepare for regulatory meetings, and navigate DoD contracts. And I think, all of that is in this, it's maybe not the 0 to 1, but it's sort of this, 2 to 10 phase as you're getting from your initial concept through then to Series A. Navigating that is difficult, and that's where we really leverage in with our network to help founders, on their own journeys.
Yeah, sticking with that though, fundraising for a lot of founders is obviously the hardest part of, I guess, starting a start company in general. I mean, it's a lot of no's, and it's a lot of we'll come back to you, but they never do, right? And in that specific case,
Yeah.
yeah, and in that, go ahead, yeah.
I was gonna say feedback is the most helpful here. Like if oftentimes these founders are going to be first time founders. It may be their first time navigating like an institutional raise and understanding how to pitch their idea in a way that cohesively tells the story and gets people interested. And I think, as a as an investor, the most helpful thing that we can do is be honest about how we're seeing things. Now, whether that's we just don't think the product is right for the market, or we don't think the market is big enough, we don't think they're raising enough money, etc. Like that is, I think, what we've seen be the
Yeah.
most helpful to founders. And actually it's something that's great, because it's oftentimes that, you start to develop this relationship with a founder, and the more you develop a relationship, like the greater the likelihood is of investing in the future. And I think that's what we
Yeah.
love, is when we give some of this feedback to founders. We might not be writing a check, but they come back to us in 6 months and they say, hey, thank you for that. We've incorporated a lot of it. This is where we're at because of it. And can we have a second conversation? And a lot of the times then it's like, okay, yeah, this makes a lot more sense. Now I think you guys are on the path that is going to yield the most value for you, and something where we can entertain that conversation, because we've seen a lot of what we perceived as risks de-risked. And again, we're one facet, one fund, and sort of one opinion here. But if we can see the founders internalizing that and then using that to make progress on the ground, we definitely want to reopen that conversation.
Right. And you kind of alluded to this before, was the concept of storytelling. And I think the best founders are the best storytellers, right? They know how to explain what they're building, the problem, why they started this. Is that something that you've seen as well, like in your kind of characterization of founders, or has it been a little bit different?
No, without a doubt. It's, I think, one of the pieces that you will often see, underdeveloped or maybe overemphasized is, founders that have an amazing looking deck, and they almost just rely on that deck to tell the story for them. Like for me, the deck in my mind is really only useful for the hook and for the IC conversations. But once I, get on the phone, I want to unpack all of that. So like I'll use the deck to structure the 4 or 5 key questions that I want to ask and get an answer to on that first call. But what I want to see is that, those questions end up just being a setup for a broader conversation. And if, the founder can take that, run with it, and effectively, narrate their story based on the areas that I'm interested as an investor, that is a huge component. That often leads to conversation 2, conversation 3, you name it, and then, hopefully investment at the end. And I think, the founders that almost rely too much, the early stage founders that almost rely too much on their deck to drive that narrative, or you're not going to be able to have that, natural and dynamic discussion that, I think it a lot of times uncovers what they're truly working towards, because the deck is polished and say, hey, this is what we're going to go after. This is the market. This is how we capture it. It's like, sure, all of that is, we need to know that, but the why you're doing it, what the core problem is, and how you've understood this to be a core problem, like what's your lived experience with that, is something that's going to come out much more in conversation than it will from sort of any, takeaway material.
Yeah, and you kind of brought up a great point there, where a lot of founders kind of are going through this process of fundraising, and they don't know what is going on. And what did you kind of figure out is like the constantly that founders misunderstand about fundraising? Like, what is that process?
Yeah. I mean, it's all very opaque, if you will, right? Sitting from the other side of the table. I think, every fund has a timeline that they'll tell you. I think, there's funds that are true to that, and there's others that, it's, you get into some of the, indecision paralysis, or just takes a lot longer to work through because you've got a greater volume. But, I think the deck piece is one maybe that founders misunderstand about the process. I think the other thing that, founders misunderstand from our side of the table is the pricing of deals. And the reason I say that is most founders don't think, early stage, especially first time, don't realize that, as an investor, it's, often just as much about the first check as well as then the second check, or a third check in some cases, and about the outcome of exit, and how you get there. And so if you price yourself too high as a founder, especially at the early stage, it creates a lot of challenges, because then you have to grow into that valuation. You have to have inflection points along the way that can, show you can grow into that, and you don't really have a lot of buffer to work against. And so, as a founder, what we want to see is you're being mindful of dilution and controlling that, and making sure that, you're getting what you've earned, but you're also leaving ample buffer along the way such that if you need to make a pivot or if stuff takes a little bit longer, the experiment that you ran didn't pan out and you're tweaking something, you've A, got the cash, and B, you haven't stamped a valuation against that where you can't afford to take that extra time. Because in those cases, you end up with a bridge round a lot of the times, and you effectively land with the same dilution that you were trying to avoid in the first place. And so, I think, don't try to get over your skis, as a founder in terms of the valuation. That will come. If you can be successful in the early stage and you can really understand the product market fit, like that will come. You'll generate the revenue and the valuation will come on the back of that.
Right. And, price is such a big thing, and you alluded to this as well. And we're seeing huge valuations, once again, something that you mentioned. How are you guys at Sidedoor kind of looking at these valuations, and what specific sectors, I guess, are fitting the correct valuations? And, how does that look like for you guys?
Yeah, it's always a bit nuanced, I think. I will say we often have the conversation internally. Some deals are expensive for a reason. And if you understand the reason why they're expensive, then you should probably be investing. But for us, the price is often indicative of market sizing. But you got to be a little bit careful there as well, because there's plenty of examples where, a market hasn't existed and has been manifested by the product or service, that has been created. And it's about, I think, being able to time that and understand where some of these markets don't exist that are going to evolve to, in the near future. I think in general, I think that the health tech side of things is probably a little bit overvalued. And I say that because of, some of the challenges in getting to market. Maybe there's not as much regulatory pressure there, but there's still very long sales cycles. There's still, multiple committees that you have to get through, and you're still looking at this, pilot to enterprise conversion sort of dynamic and mechanics. And there's certainly value in a lot of these health tech solutions, but I think that value is generated later downstream, and especially once you have this widespread adoption. Those are maybe a little bit overpriced. I think anything you see on the biotech or tech bio are generally pretty good. And that's, I think there's more history there with those specific sectors within healthcare. And, you can't misprice yourself there, because you'll be sort of adverse selection to the rest of the opportunities that funds are seeing.
Right. And is there one investment that you guys passed on that pretty much keeps you up at night?
Yeah. There's a few that we look back on, but one that makes us toss and turn the most is an AI-powered critical materials exploration company, so outside of healthcare. And it came through a really well-respected, deep tech investor. It aligned with the thesis around critical materials and sort of the energy transition, that our team had been exploring and developing. And, we went really deep. We spent tons of time in diligence. We talked to sort of senior geologists and technology leads at some of the world's largest mining companies. And, I think everything came back really strong when we were looking into this. The tech was differentiated, the team was exceptional, and the problem was massive. But at the end of the day, we didn't think they were raising enough capital to get enough shots on goal and essentially, hit their roadmap that they had outlined. Underpinning that is the mineral exploration is expensive, and we worried that the runway wouldn't be, long enough to prove out the model. And, they weren't giving themselves enough of this buffer. And, sort of wrong at the end, but, we weren't alone in the concern. And the founder, themselves told us live when we were on with them, sharing that we were going to pass in the round, that, he understood our concerns and he could agree. It turned out, that this was one of the founders that, despite the plan on paper seeming unachievable, he pushed through it, he manifested it, and he made it work. And, we don't regret the decision, because I think we made it for the right fundamental reasons, and our concerns were warranted, but we certainly regret the outcome here. And this goes back to what we talked about earlier, but the real lesson is we should have leaned harder into the founder here. That's at the end of the day what exceptional founders do. They find a way to make it work even when the plan says it shouldn't work. And it goes back to that pattern matching and learning how to understand these exceptional founders and where they're just different than some of the others that you see. And so, it's a little bit easier to sleep at night, I think, for those reasons. Again, we made the right decision based on principle, but it still makes us toss and turn a little bit.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, I think that's the biggest thing. Like once you find the most exceptional founder, there's nothing else that can beat that. I mean, I think that's the biggest kind of takeaway in general that I've been learning as well is no matter how quote unquote boring the business is, or no matter how much that they're pitching doesn't make sense, or if they look exceptional, gotta have to take the bet. It sounds like the best move. But yeah, in that case, kind of going into more on the side door, how long does it take from like the first investment or just like the first pitch to the official investment decision? What does that timeline look like?
Yeah, we try to run a tight ship. We like to get to first conversation to answer in 3 to 4 weeks. It depends I think it depends on the sector in a lot of cases, how much, we've got to diligence through. Deep tech and healthcare, and when I say healthcare, like specifically more on like the biotech, or the therapeutic side of the house tends to take a little bit longer there. But one of the things we don't want to be is just a black box for founders where they have that first conversation and then they don't ever hear from us again and they're left in this limbo phase that you alluded to earlier. If we know we're going to be out and it's just not a fit for us, we want to get that answer back to them as quick as we can. We'll always have a first conversation with the team and sort of, gather the thoughts on, we like it for this reason, we maybe don't love it for this other reason. These are the challenges we see. That always circles back into the feedback that we provide the founders. And then if we're gonna lean in, we run that diligence as fast as we can. And a lot of that is A, we don't want to be wasting the founders' time, and B, we want to be able to make a decision quickly, move, and then keep running on to the next and ultimately helping that founder build.
Interesting. And in that specific, going into healthcare, as we mentioned very in the beginning, Sidor is very a generalist fund. But what makes you super excited to kind of look a lot into healthcare? Like, why is that worth kind of looking into despite all the heavy compliance, all the long sales cycles? And as you mentioned, biotech is something that you guys are looking a little bit more into, but why is that a big concept for you guys overall?
Yeah, I mean, for me, maybe it's a little bit personal. I spent my career in healthcare in a bunch of different sort of areas. It's something that I've always been very interested in. I was, I guess, early, in my childhood, I again, on this builder theme, I wanted to be a marine robotics engineer. And then, I was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes when I was 15, and my mindset shifted a little bit, and I still wanted to build, but the building shifted to healthcare. And, I got some internships in labs and started understanding, what was being thought of from like a disease progression or a treatment space. And that's persisted in throughout the rest of my career. I think, understanding the body systems and additionally how to intervene is something that I'm just, very, very interested in. The complexity of it all is, can be a little bit daunting, I think, especially for those that, don't invest in healthcare. And even for us, like, it always ends up being a little bit of apples to oranges comparison when we're on IC and we're weighing, healthcare deals versus the others that we're seeing in the pipeline. It's something that's worth doing. If you can help move this industry along, is helping individuals lead healthier, longer lives, that's something very much worth doing in my opinion, not only from my own experience, but, just sort of what you see in the world and, some of the debilitating diseases that arguably we keep getting a better understanding each day on how to address, approach it and treat. And that's part of the cycle that I want to be a part of. And, again, from the innovation side, I just think there's always so much interesting developments, or so many interesting developments, I should say, that are happening, in the healthcare spectrum, whether that be from, new therapeutics, new clinical paradigms, and then even like looking a little bit farther into, how we think about, aging and, care shifting from inpatient to outpatient, et cetera.
Yeah, and that kind of goes right into like the next kind of thought that I had was, we're in the business of backing, revolutionizing companies that'll be, worth a lot, and what kind of specific sectors in healthcare, biotech are you looking at that's prime for venture scale disruption right now? And what other sectors are not really in there?
Yeah, you know, I think it's about following some of the breadcrumbs, if you will, and like those that are primed for venture scale investing right now, I think toe the line a little bit on like what's the next wave of innovation, but also like what's achievable in the near term. So like I almost think about this and I'll riff on, one of the other things that we were, discussing before we jumped on the podcast, but is this idea of, non-consensus and right and almost like non-consensus and early and wrong. And I love this question because of the nuance around the non-consensus early and wrong, because you can definitely be non-consensus too early and right. And so it's like, how do you separate that nuance here? Ultimately, if you are non-consensus too early and right, you end up being wrong because you invested in the wrong cycle, or you invested just too early for that to mature into a viable business. And I think understanding, that difference between too early and too late is where the most value is generated, at the founder company formation and at the, the venture investing side of things. And it does allude to like, well, what's prime for venture scale investing right now and what's not. And maybe like, within this same vein and to take a little bit of a step back, I've always thought that the non-consensus is maybe an overly simplified way of bucketing areas where people are just, avoiding and that are experiencing some sort of sentiment shift. But, it's not a shift that I think is, because investors don't believe a space is viable, but because they don't believe it's viable for the, the model of their fund and the ways that they need to return capital, whether that's on a timeline, whether that's on a, ultimate, markup, etc. And I think a couple of really good examples of this are playing out in the longevity space currently. There's a lot of recent activity in longevity. I think it's very polarizing when you think about the investing side of the house and either going after it or staying out of it at the moment. When I think about this and think about is it primed or not, is the challenge with longevity is twofold. One is understanding and measuring the outcomes across a reasonable time horizon, and then being able to extrapolate forward from that. And two is like how does any of this get reimbursed? And if it's not necessarily getting reimbursed through traditional channels, well, is the cash pay market big enough to support early wave of companies outside of the payer system or traditional payment rails? For me, the current stage of longevity sort of culminates in a lack of longitudinal data that enables, us as the investor to make informed decisions. I think it's a little bit similar, honestly, with the gut health and microbiome. There's a lot of novel approaches and mechanisms, but how can you concretely determine if they're going to yield the intended outcome across the time horizon that you're looking at? And like I alluded to this earlier, but healthcare traditionally is very mechanistically focused. It's like single pathway, single interference point, controlled outcome. Longevity starts to look a lot more like systems engineering, which is difficult to predict and measure and requires, a significant greater depth of understanding than I think we have the data to support today. It's a space that's going to produce massive winners, but right now, I think it's right and too early. And there's going to be an intermediate step along the way that leads to...
I want to I wanted to break that down a little bit because you said that we don't have the enough data right now to kind of make those coherent conclusions about specific longevity companies that are going to be kind of breakout or even for the future. Or what data do we need to kind of make those decisions that we don't have? I guess that's a hard question to answer, but what does that look like?
Yeah, I think like this, and this is where it gets challenging. Like for me, like I want to see longitudinal data across like a significant time horizon. It's like, okay, so if I make, because again, if you consider this like longevity being at least right now more of a systems level understanding and engineering problem, is like if I make change A today and that produces change B tomorrow in what I've experimented on, can I reasonably say that change is going to persist across like the duration of life, if you will, in terms of like how you're thinking of longevity, and that you won't actually have created an unintended change that leads to downstream consequence? And this is actually a bit where I think there's going to be an intermediate, because there's learnings that we can glean from basically cellular aging and the aging process. But rather than, trying to tackle this all at once from a longevity angle, I think those learnings can be applied to disease states and different indications. And what you can start doing is like understanding, okay, at, the, more or less at the individual pathway or mechanistic level, where are some of the, promising innovations on the longevity side that you apply to a well understood biological pathway with sort of that, constrained mechanism, interference point outcome. And that also already has an existing structure for reimbursement guidance and where you can measure outcomes definitively. Because at the end of the day, like that's part of the step that I think we need to make, as we're looking at this longevity is like, don't shoot for this is gonna extend your life by 5 years, or this is gonna make you biologically 5 years younger, or whatever it is. Those are, I think it gets into the ROI sort of piece of this. Like if you're thinking about back to one of the earlier questions, I'm a tool for clinicians, and am I improving the revenue or am I improving the efficiency at which you run? And I think longevity, it's hard when you're looking at this sort of systems level to be able to definitively prove that what you're doing like fits into one of those buckets, if you will, and you can do that through I think more well understood disease categories. You can apply the same learnings, but you take this intermediate step. That's where it's like early and right because of what the near-term outcomes can be.
Right. And kind of going into that, and when you guys speak to founders a lot of selling to clinics, health systems, and payers, what do you usually recommend to sell? Like, how do you guys recommend them to sell? Like, how does that look like overall?
Yeah, it's a bit of a painful process when you're thinking of selling into payers or providers. Obviously the sales cycles are longer. I think like the best thing to do is, and this is, I think this is well documented and understood, but IT can end up being either your best friend or like your worst nightmare. And so, if you're gonna be integrated, on a network, especially like as you go to larger health systems, proactively understanding what those IT departments are going to be looking for is critically important, and then building that into the product and making sure it's it's highlighted effectively when you get into those conversations, I think is key. Like the other thing, and again, it's going to double down, is just like make sure you understand your story for your audience. Like when you're selling into these clinics or payers, make sure that depending on who you're talking to at that organization, you're driving towards the outcome that is most important to them. Is it efficiency? Is it revenue build? Is it something else? And you're probably going to have to cut your story up for those audiences, and just making sure you understand how to cut that up, how to deliver it, and how to, wrap that story around it. Given that storytelling is, one of the key elements that we've spoken about that differentiates founders from the VC perspective, but it also differentiates founders when they get to the pitch to a potential customer.
And if I asked one of your portfolio companies like what the benefit of working with SideDoor is, what do you think they're going to say?
Yeah, it's a great question, and one that I would love to hear from the other side of the table. But again, like I'll double down on the value question of like, well, what does SideDoor provide for founders? And I think we've got the experience from the team, and we've got some of the, we've been there, done that a little bit to really help founders scale. And so like if you think about it, like that's the value prop that we can bring. I think that's the value prop that resonates from founders, or resonates with founders. And that's sort of the wedge where we can get it in a punch above our weight from a check size component.
Yeah.
I hope that's what founders would say about us. Again, I'd love to see it from the other side of the table, but that's what we're working towards.
Yeah, quick question before we go to a rapid fire here is, you alluded in the very beginning, one interesting kind of sector in healthcare that you're looking into is neuro, and that kind of got into my head because I think neuro is fascinating. What in neuro is very like in that direction are you like looking into, a lot more? I mean, we see a lot of, Neuralink type of innovation. We see a lot of technology kind of going more on the mental disability side of things. We see a lot of technology on the sports side of things for seizures and concussions. Where is your head kind of wrapped around in neuro?
Yeah, and we've seen it all. I think to your point, in terms of like the areas that, neuro, I think is progressing in just like the breadth of the category in general. I think for us, like what becomes particularly interesting is the neurodegeneration side of things, how you can effectively intervene. And more so, it's like understanding, I think, disease progression and predisposition. Thematically, if you will, drawing all the way back to that first question, is there's an interesting data component to this, and it's like, okay, well, how can you understand what's happening in something that you don't have direct access to, which is the brain? It's like, well, what are some of those secondary or tertiary signals that you can extrapolate from to build that map and build that understanding? I think that's going to be particularly interesting from the diagnostics as well as the data perspective. And it's like, once you have that, can you start thinking about how the brain and the neurosystem is self-regulating, just naturally? And can you build treatments that are honestly similar to some of the, immunotherapies that you're seeing in oncology that are either resetting or sort of re-engaging that neuroimmune system or I would say, immune-like system in the brain, and leveraging what already exists and maybe what's gone awry, whether it be from genetics, whether it be from epigenetics, et cetera. And I think like those are two areas that are very interesting. It's less so, I think, on the, the health tech side and maybe more so on the biotech side.
Yeah, definitely.
But, again, like neuro, there's a ton of different stuff you can do here. And it ends up, unfortunately, a lot of this ends up being a chronic disease. And so it's like, well, it's the management of that chronic disease, I think, on the health tech side, where there's a lot of opportunity. Concussions is a great example. It's starts out as an acute, but oftentimes that, problem manifests more as a chronic. And,
Right.
If you've had one really bad concussion, you're not only susceptible for additional ones, but you're probably going to be dealing with some of the symptoms and side effects for, a significant, portion of time after that injury. Ideally not for, the remainder of your life. How can you address that in a way that, it's hard to describe, but address it in a way that allows the patient to understand what they're experiencing better. Yep. And also how to, I think, avoid some of the aggravation events that can trigger, an episodic relapse, which is, I think, what you find in a lot of cases of mental health diseases and disorders.
Right. And that's a big thing, kind of the quality education piece for patients or the consumers is such a big thing. I feel like that's going to be such a huge piece coming into 2027 and on, when we kind of focus on how can we focus on preventive medicine side instead of just going on to like the current concept of sick care, where you only go to the clinic when you're sick and then kind of get out feeling a little bit unsick, but you get even worse later. Like, how can we focus on that preventive side so we can limit those concussions, or potentially even if you get that concussion, kind of limit the higher chance of getting another concussion overall?
Yeah. And I love the preventative side. It always just becomes like, how do you effectively reimburse or convince a payer to reimburse for prevention if ultimately it might not matter? And I think this is part of the problem. Like one of the things, that we think about in the treatment of chronic diseases is like, well, if I'm a payer and, my lifetime, and I'm on the commercial side, and my lifetime value of that patient is, maybe only 5 or 6 years, and it's probably decreasing as, people switch jobs more frequently. How much do you actually care and emphasize on the preventative side of things? And how much supportive evidence do you need to see to be able to be convinced that that's where you should be directing some of your coverage?
Yeah, and that's 100%. Kind of going to a quick rapid fire here. Are you ready?
I hope so. I mean, we're going to find out.
Yeah, so who is one founder that's not on your cap table that you respect the most?
Yeah, listen, I don't want to name names. I'll give the cop-out answer is like, Elon Musk is sort of the ultimate founder because he emphasizes, that it's just going to get done regardless of, how many people tell him no or how unbelievable it is. As far as like, the founders that we've interacted with, and I should say interact with, but aren't on the cap table. Yeah, I won't name names because we're in the process of trying to get them get us on the cap table and bring them into the network. So I don't want to, potentially let slip an advantage that we might have. I think again though, like the types of founders that we want are those that just don't believe that challenges exist. And that's an overly simplified way of putting it. But I think just have a unique way of viewing those challenges and working through them so that, it avoids the normal constraints that you or I or anybody else would expect or view as existing.
Yeah. Where do you want to see Side Door in 3 to 5 years from now?
Yeah. I think, I'd love to see us, right now we're a smaller fund. I want to see us go out and raise that 100 million, 200 million, whatever it is, size fund. I think there's a lot of interesting stuff that we can do, like thematically focused on, deep tech and healthcare in itself. And, the Generals Fund is great. I think it's where we started. We'll be true to the respects to our, our roots and in respects to that for, I think the foreseeable future, but it's also, can we start doing stuff with a more focused, effort and view towards what's happening in deep tech or what's happening in healthcare and going some of these sector specific angles with, either within the fund or as a separate vehicle itself.
Yeah. What is kind of like the, I guess, sectors in healthcare that you think are going to be the biggest kind of pullers in the next coming years?
RNA. And specifically RNA therapies or RNA interference therapies, whether it be, on the small molecule side, I think is becoming really interesting. You just saw, or you might have seen the Orna acquisition, the RNA becomes, a much more elegant way of drugging than, proteins and some of these large molecules. And so I think that space is going to start picking up. There's, still some delivery challenges, I think within, the RNA therapeutics themselves, but that space I think will pick up again. Like it's this understanding of what's happening in the cellular environment beyond what the genetic code is going to tell you. That can be, I think that has to be anchored disease specific in some routes, but it's also just like this bigger angle towards this post translation sort of thought and how and when and why are seeing these post translational observations.
Yeah.
And then, AI is going to eat everything in healthcare, if you will, from like the operations standpoint. I think there's going to be a lot of interesting tooling, especially from like the data architecture and piping standpoint, and like how can you, as a practice, better build your own, tooling that allows you to run more efficiently and execute specific functions that, previously took 3 or 4 vendors, where you're just, now building off your own, sort of, AI, coding agent, or you're using a tool that's then done all of that for you. Begs the question of how does healthcare going to view this risk, and are they going to build any of it themselves? Or are they going to sort of insulate themselves with a third party? But either way, I think you're going to see a lot of stuff that was, deemed too difficult or too expensive to try to fix start getting turned over quickly.
Yeah. How has it been managing or pitching LPs to raise your next funds, or how has that been overall compared to what you guys are doing now?
Yeah. It's the venture cycle is long. I think, we've had a lot of really, really good investments, and, on paper they look great, but at the end of the day, you don't understand if you're a true winner until you pay out and you see an exit event. I think it's not easy to raise a fund right now by any respects. The 2021 and 2022 of free money is not necessarily the environment that we're working in right now. But I think, as we build the network with the fund side and then, with the LP side, those both big at each other. Luckily, unluckily, I haven't been as involved in some of the fundraising on our side. And I've been heads down more so on the investing side, but those conversations are picking back up again. And, we're looking towards the future and, what does the fund 3 look like? How big is that going to be? And honestly, like, where are we going geographically? The fund 1 and fund 2 were largely US and Canadian focused. We made investments outside of that. We're exploring areas, I think, in other geographies for more geographic specific, fund spin-ups.
Yeah. Final question here. How has it been balancing the venture side and personal life? How has that been overall?
Yeah. It's hectic. Yeah. It's probably a better question for my wife to answer, but it's one of those things, yeah, founders and deals will move irrespective of anything else that's happening. And we've got a great team. So it's like if, I have to be out or someone else from the team has to be out, we'll pick up the slack. And I think, that's what helps keep us competitive. And I try to keep it, parsed as much as I can and have the personal life, and then, keep things running on the side door and then just deal with the challenges that come up.
Yeah. Jay, it's amazing to have you on the show, and I enjoyed this so much. It was truly a pleasure. So thank you so much for being here. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Vic. Truly a pleasure. I really enjoyed the conversation and looking forward to many more between us.